Cordelia Ashfield, Duchess of Rowden, did not scream. She did not weep. She did not push back her chair or raise her voice above the register she used for ordinary things, the register she used for asking a footman to mend the fire, or telling a tenant that his rent would be forgiven for the quarter. She set her wine-glass down on the white cloth, with both hands, slowly, as though it were something that might shatter if she trusted it to one. 22 candles burned along the length of the Rowden dining table that night, and every one of them showed her face, perfectly still. Camille Severin had spoken in French, low and pleasant, the words dressed up as a compliment to whoever might overhear them in English. She had smiled while she said it, the smile of a woman certain that the steward's daughter across the table could not possibly follow her meaning. Elle n'est pas aimée. Elle est utile. She is not loved. She is useful. A small laugh went round that end of the table, the laugh of people who believed themselves alone in understanding a joke. Cordelia lifted her hand to the ribbon at her throat, where a small enamelled ring hung hidden beneath her bodice, and she did not touch it the way a woman touches a thing for comfort. She touched it the way a woman touches a thing to remind herself what she has already survived. Then she looked directly at Camille Severin, and she smiled back, and she answered her in French. By the time the fish course was cleared, the whole table would understand precisely what it had cost to underestimate her. That was still a few minutes away. For now there was only the held breath of a room realizing, one guest at a time, that the joke had not landed where it was aimed. The autumn of 1816 had come to the county of Wexbourne the way it always did. Heavy and gold, and entirely indifferent to the households it moved through. Harvest had been thin that year, the wheat coming in light after a wet August, and every estate from Rowden Hall to the Pemberton, lands to the north, had spent September counting sheaves and frowning over the sums. It was, in other words, an ordinary autumn, the kind in which a competent household ran quietly and a poorly run one began, very slowly, to come apart at the seams. Rowden Hall had not come apart, though for 2 years many in the county had expected it to. Julian Ashfield, 9th Duke of Rowden, had inherited an estate in worse condition than his title suggested, mortgaged pasture land, a roof that leaked into the long gallery, tenant farms that had not seen a fair lease renewal in a generation, because his father had preferred ledgers he did not have to look at closely. He had inherited, too, a doctrine, delivered to him at 12 years old by that same father in the flat voice of a man reciting a lesson he had learned at cost. Love is a debt collector who calls in the middle of the night, and a wise man marries for use, so that he is never surprised by what is owed. Julian's mother had left when he was 11. She had gone north with a man who wrote her poetry, and she had not taken her son, and the previous duke had spent the rest of his life turning that fact into a philosophy rather than a wound, because a philosophy could be managed and a wound could not. He raised his son on ledgers and restraint. He taught him that affection was a luxury estates the size of Rowden could not afford. Not with the roof the way it was, not with the tenant arrears the way they were. So when Julian came of age and inherited both the debt and the doctrine, he did what he had been raised to do. He looked for a wife the way he looked at a fallow field, for what it could be made to yield. Cordelia Hale had been the land steward's daughter at Ashworth Park, the neighbouring estate, before she was anything else. Her father, Mr. Josiah Hale, had kept books so precise that the Ashworth family solicitor once said, only half in jest, that he trusted Hale's ledgers further than he trusted his own eyes. Cordelia had grown up at that man's elbow, learning double columns and quarter-day rents before she learnt to dance, and when her father died of a lung fever the winter she was 22, he left her 3 things: a small estate cottage, a single enamelled ring that had been her mother's, and a habit of mind that would outlast both. He had also left her a sentence, repeated so often in her childhood that it had worn smooth as a river stone, and she said it to herself now the way other women said prayers. A woman who is prepared owes fear to no one. It was, in the end, her preparedness that brought her to Rowden. Julian Ashfield had come to Ashworth Park on a state business 18 months after her father's death, had watched her untangle a boundary dispute over 3 seasons of muddled surveys in a single afternoon, and had proposed marriage to her 4 months later with all the warmth of a man securing a competent land agent. He did not court her, he interviewed her, in effect, and she, 24 years old, without prospects, without a dowry worth mentioning, and entirely without illusions about what love was worth to men who had been taught it was worthless, accepted him with her eyes open. She had told herself, on her wedding morning, that a marriage built on being needed was still a marriage, and that being needed was not nothing. It had taken 2 years at Rowden Hall for her to learn that being needed and being loved were, as her husband's own father might have said, different countries, and that she had married into the wrong one. Julian was not cruel. That was the thing the county never quite understood about him, watching from its drawing rooms and forming its opinions over cards. He never raised his voice to her. He never withheld money or comfort or the outward courtesies a wife was owed. He simply managed her the way he managed everything else at Rowden, efficiently, correctly, and with a locked door somewhere behind his ribs that he had built at 11 years old and reinforced every year since. He thanked her for her work on the estate books, the way he thanked a good steward. He praised her arithmetic. He never once, in 2 years, said a word about her company, her conversation, her face across a table, or anything at all that could not be entered as a credit in a ledger. She had catalogued this quietly, the way she catalogued everything, and she had filed the ache of it away in the place she kept things she could not yet afford to feel. She thought of that place as a drawer in a writing desk, one she kept shut with a small brass key, and she opened it only in the 10 minutes she allowed herself each week, on Sunday evenings, after the house had gone quiet. 10 minutes to grieve the marriage she had not gotten. Then the key turned, the drawer shut, and she went back to the ledgers, because the ledgers, unlike her husband, never disappointed her by being exactly what they appeared to be. It was into this arrangement, orderly, bloodless, and entirely survivable, that Camille Severine arrived in September of 1816, presented to the county as the orphaned daughter of Julian's late Latin tutor, a Frenchwoman of good family fallen on hard times, deserving of charity and a place at good tables. She was beautiful in the particular way of women who have made a study of being watched, and she spoke 3 languages fluently, and she had known Julian Ashfield since he was 17 years old, in ways the county chose politely not to inquire into. Cordelia had known within a week of meeting her exactly what Camille Severin was, and exactly what she had been to her husband before his marriage, and very likely what she still hoped to be after it. She had said nothing. She had simply watched, the way she watched everything, grey eyes cataloguing a room and giving nothing back, and she had waited to see what use the woman intended to make of her charity and her French. She did not have to wait long. The dinner that October was meant to celebrate nothing in particular, the end of harvest, the beginning of the shooting season, an excuse for the county's better families to sit at Rowden's table and admire its restored east wing. Cordelia had planned the menu herself, down to the cost of the fish, and had seated Camille Severin 4 places from her husband, because propriety demanded she be seated somewhere, and etiquette forbade seating her closer. She had thought that distance would be sufficient. She had not accounted for the fact that French, spoken quietly across a dinner table, requires no distance at all to do its work. Camille had waited until the 2nd course, until the wine had done its work on the table's good humour, before she leaned toward the lady on her right and delivered her observation about the Duchess in a French drawing-room murmur, pitched to carry exactly as far as it needed to, and no further. She had looked directly at Cordelia while she said it. She had smiled the whole time, the smile of a woman who believed a steward's daughter would never have had cause to learn a language spoken only in ballrooms and diplomatic drawing-rooms, a language that was, in Camille's private accounting, a kind of paper, the sort of credential the merely useful could never forge. She was wrong about the ledger. She had simply never seen the whole of it. Cordelia Ashfield set down her wine-glass. She did not scream, and she did not weep, and she did not so much as colour at the ears, though every woman at that table who had ever been called useful in a marriage felt, for one unbearable second, the exact shape of the insult land on her own skin instead. Cordelia lifted her chin the smallest measure. She touched the ribbon at her throat once, the way a soldier touches a medal before he walks into a room he has been dreading, and she answered Camille Severin in French, so clean and so unhurried that 3 separate guests would later swear, quite falsely, that she must have been raised speaking it in the nursery. "Vous avez raison," she said. "You are quite right. Je suis utile. Et vous, madame, que faites-vous? Exactement. Part sourire? And you, madame, what precisely do you do, besides smile?" The table went very quiet. Somewhere down its length, a gentleman who did understand French made a small, helpless sound into his napkin that was not entirely a cough. Camille Severin's smile did not move, but something behind it did, the particular stillness of a woman recalculating a sum she had been certain would come out in her favour. Julian Ashfield, at the head of his own table, looked at his wife as though he were seeing her enter a room he had not known existed in his own house. The rest of the dinner passed in the ordinary noise of forks and wine and county gossip resuming its usual channels, but nothing at that table was ordinary again, and everyone present knew it, and no one said so aloud. Cordelia ate her fish. She answered a question about the harvest yields with 3 precise figures that silenced a debate that had been running for a quarter of an hour. She smiled at the appropriate moments and laughed once, briefly, at a joke that was not particularly funny, because a woman who has just detonated a small, elegant bomb in French across her own dinner table does well to appear entirely unbothered by the fact of it. She held that composure through the last course, through the ladies' withdrawal, through 40 minutes of drawing-room conversation, in which 3 matrons found excuses to ask her, with poorly concealed delight, where on earth she had learned her French. She held it through the departure of the last carriage, through the candles being snuffed one by one down the long gallery, through the walk up the east stairs to her own rooms with her husband's footsteps somewhere behind her, on the same staircase, not quite beside her, not quite apart. She held it until she reached her sitting-room and shut the door, and only then did she sit down at her writing desk, take out the small brass key she kept in her workbox, and allow herself, for once outside the appointed Sunday hour, exactly 10 minutes with the drawer open. She did not cry even then. She sat with her hands flat on the desk, and she let herself feel the whole shape of it, 2 years of being catalogued as an asset, condensed into one French sentence, spoken by her husband's former mistress in front of 40 guests. And when the 10 minutes were finished, she closed the drawer, turned the key, and reached instead for the estate ledger she had left half finished that morning. She had work to do. Rowden Hall's housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, had served the family for 31 years, and had buried 2 dukes' worth of opinions about the family under a manner so plain it discouraged questions. She found the Duchess at the ledger past midnight. The candle burned low, and she said nothing about the dinner at all. She simply set down a cup of chocolate at Cordelia's elbow, and stood a moment, arms folded, looking at the columns of figures with the particular disapproval of a woman who believed accounts should be kept in daylight hours by daylight people. That Frenchwoman, Mrs. Pruitt said at last, will find her arithmetic does not add up the way she thinks it does. I hope so, Cordelia said, not looking up. You answered her proper. Mrs. Pruitt sniffed. In her own coin. I never heard the like. It was only French, Mrs. Pruitt. It was more than French, the housekeeper said. And you know it, Your Grace, so there's no use being modest about it in front of me. I've known you 3 years. You've never once been modest with a ledger, and this was a kind of ledger too. She paused at the door. He watched you the whole time, you know. His Grace watched you like a man who's misplaced something and just found it under his own roof. Cordelia's pen did not stop moving across the page. He watched me, she said, the way a man watches an investment that has unexpectedly appreciated. That is not the same thing, Mrs. Pruitt, no, the housekeeper agreed, after a moment. But it is a start. She left, and Cordelia worked until the candle guttered, entering figures into columns that never once lied to her, no matter what else in her life had, and somewhere beneath the arithmetic, quietly, without her quite permitting it, a small unfamiliar thought took root, that a woman who could silence a room in a language not her own might, with time and the right numbers, silence rather more than that. The drainage dispute on the Fenwick allotments had been dragging on for 3 years by the time Cordelia turned her attention to it, which was 3 years longer than it needed to. She had heard of it first from Lady Agatha Fenwick, Julian's widowed aunt, who lived in the dower cottage at the edge of the estate, and who had a gift for saying exactly what she thought in exactly as few words as the thought required. Ridley's fields flood every spring because Marsh's tenant built his ditch wrong 40 years ago, Lady Agatha said over tea, the week after the dinner, and nobody has fixed it because nobody wants to pay for it, and everybody would rather argue about whose fault it is than mend it. Julian's father let it run because arguing costs nothing, and mending costs money. You'll want to know that before you go poking at it. I intend to poke at it, Cordelia said. I thought you might. Lady Agatha studied her a moment, the frank appraising look of a woman deciding whether someone was worth her trouble. She had heard, of course, about the dinner. The whole county had heard about the dinner within 2 days, embroidered in every retelling, until Cordelia was rumoured to have delivered her retort in 4 languages, and a Latin epigram besides, and she had come to call rather sooner than the season strictly required. You did well at that table, she said. Better than well. But a clever answer buys you 1 evening of admiration. It does not buy you a county. If you want this house to stop whispering about you as an oddity, and start reckoning with you as a power, you will need to give them something they can see with their own eyes. Out of doors, where the whole parish watches. The drainage, Cordelia said. The drainage, Lady Agatha agreed, will do very well. It took her 3 weeks to untangle it properly. Old surveys pulled from the muniment room, a conversation with the marsh tenant that began in suspicion and ended, 4 hours later, in his sketching the original ditch line from memory onto the back of a feed bill. A morning spent walking the boundary herself in boots borrowed from a groom, because her own were unsuited to standing calf-deep in air. Wexbourne allotment in October. She found, in the end, that the dispute had never been about malice at all. It was a miscalculated gradient, 6 inches of fall lost over 400 yards, because the original ditch had been cut following an old hedge line, instead of the actual slope of the land, and every flood since had been the arithmetic finally, patiently, taking its revenge on a decision made 2 generations ago by men no longer alive to be blamed for it. She proposed a new channel, cut on the true gradient, split the cost 3 ways between the estate and the 2 tenant farms according to acreage benefited, and set the figures out on a single page so plain that even Marsh's tenant, who had spent 3 years insisting the fault lay entirely with his neighbour, read it twice and then said, slowly, "Well, I'll be." He signed the agreement that same afternoon, in Mrs. Pruitt's kitchen, over a jug of small beer, and by the following Sunday half the parish had heard that the new Duchess had settled in 3 weeks a quarrel that had outlasted 2 harvests and 1 funeral. Julian heard of it from his own steward, a full day before his wife thought to mention it to him at all, which told him something about how little she expected him to care. He found her in the estate office that evening, bent over the ledger where she had entered the new arrangement in her own clean hand, and he stood in the doorway a moment before she noticed him, watching her work with an attention he had not, until recently, thought to spend on anything but the figures themselves. "Ridley tells me you walked the whole boundary yourself," he said. "In his boots, in a groom's boots. Ridley's would not have fit me." She did not look up from the page. The survey from 1791 had the gradient wrong. Someone had followed the hedge instead of the land. "You might have sent the steward to walk it. The steward has walked it for 3 years and settled nothing. I wanted to see the ground myself before I trusted anyone else's account of it." Julian crossed the room and looked down at the figures, at the 3 neat columns dividing the cost of the new channel between the estate and the 2 farms, with a fairness so evident that no one, reading it, could summon the energy to keep quarrelling. He was quiet for a moment. "This is good work," he said. It was, Cordelia thought, precisely the sort of thing he had said to her 100 times before. Praise measured out like a wage, correct and entirely beside the point. And yet something in his voice this time sat slightly askew of its usual register, a fraction warmer than the ledger required, and when she glanced up she found him not looking at the figures at all, but at her hands where they rested on the page. "Thank you," she said, and went back to her columns, and did not let herself wonder what the difference in his voice might mean, because a woman who built her composure out of 10 careful minutes a week could not afford to spend any of them wondering about her husband's tone. He lingered a moment longer than the ledger required before he left the room. She marked it, the way she marked everything, and entered nothing about it in any book. Camille Severin had not left Wexbourne after the dinner, though half the county had expected her to, embarrassed into a quiet withdrawal to whatever charitable household had sheltered her before Rowden's hospitality. She stayed instead, taking rooms in the village at the Fenwick Living's expense, a piece of charity Lady Agatha had not authorised, and did not care to examine too closely, since the vicar who authorised it was known to enjoy a pretty face at his table more than his stipend strictly justified, and she began, in the weeks after the dinner, to be seen in the company of a solicitor's clerk from the county town, a thin, ambitious young man named Ellery Finch, in conversations that ended abruptly whenever a third party approached. Cordelia noted this the way she noted everything, filed it without alarm, and returned to her ledgers. She did not yet know what Camille Severin was building. She would not know, in fact, for some months yet, though she would come to understand, looking back, that a woman who spends 3 weeks visiting a solicitor's clerk in a county town is not merely nursing a wounded pride. She is drafting something. And in Wexburn, as in every place Cordelia had ever lived, the thing people drafted when they meant to do lasting harm was, without exception, a piece of paper. Julian Ashfield had grown up believing that a locked door was the same thing as strength, and it took his wife's quiet, unbothered competence, walking a flooded boundary in a groom's boots, answering an insult in a language he had not known she spoke, entering figures in a hand steadier than his own, nearly a full season to begin showing him otherwise. The second trial came in November, when the tenant cottages along the eastern boundary were found, on inspection, to be in a state of disrepair that shamed the estate's account books, which had recorded repair funds spent for 3 years running on work that had, plainly, never been done. Cordelia traced the discrepancy herself, cross-referencing invoices against a builder's ledger she obtained by the simple expedient of asking the builder for it, and found that the previous steward, dismissed the year before Cordelia's marriage, retired now to a cottage 2 parishes over, had been paid for repairs on roofs that remained, by any honest measure, exactly as leaky as they had been in 1812. She brought the discrepancy to Julian in his study, laid the 2 ledgers side by side on his desk, and said nothing at all for a moment, letting the columns speak for themselves. £412, she said finally, paid out over 3 years for work I cannot find any evidence was performed. Ridley's roof still leaks into his hay store. The Coombe cottages are one hard winter from becoming uninhabitable. Julian studied the figures for a long moment, his jaw set in the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he dislikes. My father trusted that steward for 11 years, he said. Your father, Cordelia said carefully, may have found it easier to trust a man's word than to walk the boundary and see for himself. It is not a fault unique to him. It is only expensive when a man in his position indulges it. He did not answer at once. He set his pen down flat on the desk, precisely parallel to its edge, the way he did when he was buying himself a moment to think rather than to speak, and when he looked up at her, there was something in his face she had not seen there before, not quite shame, not quite gratitude, but some unfamiliar country between them. What would you have me do, he said, about £412 that no longer exists and cannot be recovered? I would have you fund the repairs properly, this time, and post the new terms where every tenant on the estate can read them, Cordelia said. Not because it undoes what was taken from them, because it tells them, in the only language that has ever meant anything to this family, that they will not be lied to again. Julian looked at her for a long moment. You speak of the estate, he said slowly, as though it were a person one might wrong or right. An estate is only ever the sum of the people on it, she said. I learnt that from my father before I learned my letters. He was quiet again, and this time when he spoke it was not about the ledgers at all. My father used to say that a man who loved anything too much would find it wanted, sooner or later, and would leave him for it, Julian said, not looking at her, looking instead at some middle distance she could not follow him into. My mother left when I was 11. He never said her name again after that, not once, in 20 years. He said instead that a wise man built his house on use, because use does not walk out the door in the middle of the night with another man's promises in its pocket. It was the first time in 2 years of marriage that he had told her anything true about himself that was not entered in a ledger. Cordelia stood very still, the way she stood still at dinner tables and boundary disputes, and did not reach for him, because some doors, once opened a crack, close again permanently if a hand moves too quickly toward them. That is a very small country to build a whole life in, she said quietly. It is the only one I was given the map to. Then perhaps, she said, it is time someone drew you a better one. He looked at her then in a way he had not looked at her before, not across a boundary dispute or a column of figures, but directly, as though she herself were the thing requiring his full attention, and for one unguarded moment something behind his eyes moved that she could not yet name. Then Mrs. Pruitt knocked with the evening post, and the moment folded itself away, but Cordelia carried it out of the study with her nonetheless, and that night, in the 10 minutes she allowed herself, she found she had almost nothing to grieve, and did not know what to do with the 10 minutes instead. The county, meanwhile, had begun to speak of the Duchess of Rowden in a register it had not used before. It was not admiration exactly, not yet. The gentry of Wexbourne moved slowly in matters of opinion. The way water moves through clay soil, resisted at every turn before it finds its channel. But something had shifted since the dinner, since the drainage, since Ridley's roof was properly mended, and the terms posted on the estate office door for any tenant to read. Mrs. Roth, who kept the finest table in the county and the sharpest tongue to go with it, was heard to remark at a card party that the new Duchess had rather more about her than one first supposed, which, from Mrs. Roth, amounted to a standing ovation. Camille Severin heard this too, in the way such things always reached her, carried by the same currents of gossip that carried everything else through a county too small to keep its secrets. She heard it, and she smiled her pleasant smile, and she continued her quiet weekly visits to Ellery Finch in the county town, where a document was being drafted that she believed would end, once and for all, the inconvenient fact of Cordelia Ashfield's marriage. The document Ellery Finch had spent 4 months drafting was, on its face, a marriage settlement, a private contract, dated the spring of 1811, 5 years before Cordelia's wedding, purporting to record a binding promise of marriage between Julian Ashfield and Camille Severin, witnessed and sealed in the old family custom the Ashfields had once used for betrothals, before the practice fell out of fashion. If genuine, it would have made Julian's promise to Camille the prior claim, and Cordelia's marriage solemnized 5 years after a binding contract Julian had never formally dissolved, a bigamous one in all but name, with every consequence that implied for the legitimacy of any child born of it. It was not genuine, but Camille Severin had learned, in her years moving through the drawing-rooms of men who mistook her for decorative, that a forgery convincing enough rarely needed to survive close examination. It needed only to survive long enough to do its damage, to force a public scandal, a hurried settlement, a sum of money paid to make an inconvenient claim disappear before anyone thought to examine the ink. She brought it to Rowden Hall herself, in December, on a morning she had chosen carefully for its cruelty, the day of the parish Christmas assembly, when half the county's better families would be gathered at the hall by evening for a dinner Cordelia had spent a fortnight arranging. She did not come to the front door. She came to the estate office, where she knew Cordelia would be found working, and she laid the document on the desk between them with the particular gentleness of a woman placing a blade where its owner will be sure to see it. "I had hoped," Camille said, in English this time, "that we might settle this quietly, between women, before it becomes a matter for solicitors and county gossip. You understand, I am sure, how these things spread." Cordelia looked at the document. She read it once, slowly, and then again, and her hands did not move from where they rested flat on the desk. "This is dated 1811, she said. "It is." "You did not know my husband in 1811. "I have known your husband," Camille said, smiling, "since he was 17 years old, madame, in every sense the word allows. The contract is genuine. I would not wish to see it made public for your sake, as much as mine, but I am a woman with very little left to lose, and a woman with nothing left to lose is not, I think, a woman you wish to have as an enemy." Cordelia was quiet for a long moment. She was aware, in some part of her mind not occupied with the immediate problem, that this was precisely the sort of moment her father had prepared her for, without ever knowing it, a woman across a desk with a piece of paper, and only the truth of the paper itself standing between order and ruin. "What is it you want?" she said at last, "since I doubt very much it is a quiet wedding 5 years too late." "A settlement," Camille said. "Generous and private, say £3,000, and my silence, and I take myself off to the continent and trouble this house no further." She smiled again. "It is a fair price for a duchess's legitimacy, I think. Cheaper than a scandal. Cheaper, certainly, than a bastard heir." Cordelia set the document down. She did not weep, and she did not rage, and she did not so much as raise her voice, though something in her chest had gone very cold and very still, the particular stillness of a woman recognizing precisely how much is at stake, and precisely how little good panic will do her. "I will need 3 days," she said, "to consider a sum of that size." "You have 3, Camille said, rising, gathering her gloves with the unhurried grace of a woman who believed she had already won. "I would not delay past the assembly on Thursday. I have found that scandals, like fish, are best served while they are fresh." She left, and Cordelia sat alone at the desk for a long moment with the false contract in front of her, and then she did what she had done every single time in her life a problem had arrived, dressed as a catastrophe. She reached for a clean sheet of paper, and she began in her clean, steady hand to make a list. She did not go to Julian first. She went, instead, to Mr. Aldous Crane, the family's solicitor in the county town, a small, precise man who had drawn up half the marriage settlements and land conveyances in Wexburn over 30 years, and who regarded forged documents with the personal offence of a craftsman confronted with shoddy work. "May I see the paper itself?" he said, when she had explained the whole of it, rather than a copy. She had thought to bring it. She had, in fact, simply taken it from her own desk drawer, where Camille had left it, on the theory that a blackmailer who cannot produce her evidence has considerably less leverage than one who can. Crane examined it under a glass for the better part of 10 minutes, turning it to the window light, running his thumb along the paper's edge. "The seal is a reasonable copy," he said at last, "though not, I think, cut from the original die. The Ashfield crest has a hare's ear a fraction too long here. See, where the true seal's is shorter. But seals can be argued over for a fortnight without settling anything. This," he tapped the paper itself, "will settle it faster." "The paper?" "Watermarks change, Your Grace, the way fashions do, only slower and rather more honestly." He held the sheet to the window. "This is laid paper from a mill I know well, Fens, out past the county town. Been in the same family 3 generations. They changed their watermark in the autumn of 1813, when old Fen died, and his son took the business over and altered the design to include his own initials. This paper carries the son's mark. He set it down. Which means, whatever else is true of this document, it was not written on paper that existed in the spring of 1811. It could not have been. The paper had not been made yet. Cordelia sat very still. "You are certain. I have bought paper from that mill for 30 years, madame. I would stake my licence on it. But you need not take my word alone. Young Fen himself will tell you the same, and swear to it if it comes to that. He keeps meticulous records of his own mill's history. Men who make paper for a living tend to respect the stuff rather more than the men who abuse it." Cordelia looked at the false contract for a long moment and felt something shift in her chest that was not quite triumph and not quite relief, but something steadier than either, the particular satisfaction of a woman who has just watched a lie become, at last, a fact she could hold in her hand and turn to the light. "Will you come to Rowden Thursday evening," she said, "and bring Mr. Fen with you, if he is willing?" "For a fee no larger than my usual, madame, I would come to watch a forger's paper convict him twice over. It is, in its way, the finest work I do." She had 3 days, and she used every one of them, not merely assembling proof, though the paper alone might have sufficed, but preparing the ground on which the truth would be made to stand. She spoke with Ellery Finch's own clerk fellow at the solicitor's office in the county town, a nervous young man named Peter Wick, who had, it transpired, copied out the false contract's language at Finch's dictation without fully understanding what he was party to, and who confessed the whole of it within a quarter hour of being asked plainly and kindly rather than threatened. She spoke with the vicar who had extended Camille Severin his living's charity, and found him considerably less willing to vouch for her character once he understood what that charity had funded. And she went, at last, to her husband on the evening before the assembly, and laid the false contract on his desk exactly as Camille had laid it on hers. Julian read it in silence. When he looked up, his face had gone the colour of old paper itself. "This is a lie," he said. "I never signed anything of the kind. I never, Cordelia. In 1811 I was barely 21, and Camille was— I know what she was to you," Cordelia said quietly. "I have known since the week I met her. That is not what concerns me tonight. What concerns me is that she means to present this at the assembly tomorrow, before the whole county, unless she is paid to hold her tongue. And I do not intend to pay her a single shilling, because I have spent 3 days proving the paper itself could not have existed in the year she claims to have signed it." Julian looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face broke open in a way she had never seen it break before. Not the composed stillness of the estate office, not the careful warmth of the drainage dispute, but something rawer, closer to fear, closer to the 11-year-old boy who had watched his mother's carriage disappear down a drive and been told, afterward, that this was simply what love cost. "I should have told you all of it, years ago," he said, "not merely that she existed, what she was, what I let myself become, believing my father, believing that a marriage built on use could never be taken from me the way love had been taken from him." He stopped, started again. "I have called you useful in this house for 2 years, Cordelia, as though it were the highest compliment I own, and I have watched you build this estate back into something whole with your own 2 hands, and I never once," He stopped a second time, and this time he did not start again immediately, and the silence sat between them, heavier than anything he might have said. "Tomorrow," Cordelia said, into that silence, "I intend to answer her before the whole county, with paper of my own. I would have you stand beside me when I do it. Not to speak for me. I have no need of that. Only to stand where everyone can see that you do." "I will stand wherever you tell me to stand," Julian said, "for as long as you will have me there." She looked at him a moment longer, and then she reached up and unclasped the ribbon at her throat, and drew out the small enamelled ring that had been her mother's, and held it a moment in her palm before she spoke. "This was the only thing that was ever entirely mine," she said, "not given to me for use, not paid to me as a wage, just mine, because someone loved me enough to leave it." She closed her hand around it. "I would like, one day, for something in this house to feel the same way. I am not asking you for it tonight. I am telling you it is the thing I want, so that you know what you are working toward, if you mean to work toward anything at all." "Show me," she said. When he opened his mouth to answer immediately, too quickly, the way a man reaches for reassurance, he has not yet earned the right to give. Not tonight, and not with words. Show me over time, and I will believe it when I see it, and not one day before. "All right," Julian said quietly. "All right then," she said. And that, for the moment, was the whole of the treaty between them. The parish Christmas assembly at Rowden Hall had never, in living memory, drawn so full a room. Some of that was the season, and some of it was the county's appetite for spectacle, after 4 months of watching the Duchess of Rowden's reputation climb steadily against every expectation set for her. But a good deal of it, Cordelia suspected, was Camille Severin's own doing. She had let it be known, in careful whispers over the preceding week, that something remarkable might be said at the Rowden Assembly this year. Something that would interest anyone who had ever wondered about the circumstances of the current Duke's marriage. She had timed her entrance for the moment the dancing paused for refreshment, when the long gallery was fullest and quietest at once, guests drifting between the supper tables with glasses in hand. Exactly the audience a woman building a scandal would choose. She crossed the room toward Cordelia and Julian with the false contract in her gloved hand, and she did not trouble to lower her voice. "Your Grace," she said to Julian, sweetly, "I had hoped we might have settled our small matter privately, but since your wife has seen fit to delay, I find I must simply say it plainly, before your guests, and let them judge for themselves what sort of marriage this house has been built on." She held up the contract. This document, dated the spring of 1811 and witnessed in the old custom, records a binding promise of marriage between myself and Julian Ashfield, made 5 years before his wedding to the woman standing beside him. I have carried it a long while. Out of loyalty I no longer feel I owe this family. I did not wish to embarrass anyone. But silence, I find, has become rather more expensive than honesty. The gallery had gone very quiet, the particular quiet of a room holding its breath to see which way a scandal will fall. Mrs. Roth's fan had stopped moving entirely. Somewhere near the supper table, a glass was set down with exaggerated care. Cordelia stepped forward. She did not raise her voice, because she had learned, over 2 years and 1 dinner table, that a voice raised in a quiet room only ever sounds like panic, and she had none to spare. "May I see the document, Miss Severin?" she said. "Not to dispute it. Only to be certain we are discussing the same paper you showed my husband's solicitor 3 days ago." Camille hesitated, only a fraction of a second, but a fraction was enough for the gallery to note it. She handed the contract over with the air of a woman confident it could withstand any scrutiny offered. "Mr. Crane," Cordelia said, and the solicitor stepped forward from where he had been standing, unremarked, near the gallery's far door. "Would you be so good as to tell the room what you found when you examined this paper 3 days ago?" Crane held the document up, angled it toward the candlelight so that its texture caught the glow, and spoke in the flat, unhurried voice of a man who had spent 30 years making dry facts sound like verdicts. "This paper," he said, "was milled by Fenn and Sons, of the county town, on stock bearing a watermark the mill did not begin using until the autumn of 1813, 2 full years after the date this contract claims to have been signed. I would not ask the room to take my word for it alone." He gestured, and a young man Cordelia had brought from the county town that afternoon, dressed in his good coat and plainly uncomfortable at finding himself the object of 40 pairs of eyes, stepped forward from the edge of the gallery. "I'm Josiah Fenn," he said, his voice unsteady but clear enough to carry. "My father kept the mill before me, and I keep it now, and I've the ledgers to show when every mark we've ever cut went into use. This paper's mine, my mark, not my father's, and my mark didn't exist till 2 years after the date wrote on it. I'll swear to that on anything you like." A murmur moved through the gallery, the particular murmur of a room's opinion turning over all at once, like a tide that has been building against a seawall for an hour finally finding the crack that lets it through. "There is more," Cordelia said into the murmur, and her voice did not rise, though the room quieted further to hear it, if the assembly wishes to hear it. A second young man came forward at her nod, Peter Wick, Ellery Finch's clerk fellow, pale and sweating despite the December cold, but steady enough once he began to speak. "Mr. Finch had me copy the wording out myself," he said, from a draft he wrote in his own hand, not 3 months past. "I didn't know then what it was meant to do. I know now, and I'd rather say so plain than carry it the rest of my life." Camille Severin's composure, which had carried her through drawing-rooms and dinner-tables and 4 months of patient forgery, did not shatter all at once. It simply went out, the way a candle goes out when the wick has finally burned through what little wax was left to feed it. Not a dramatic collapse, but a small, final dimming, there and then not there, and the room watched it happen with the fascinated, faintly pitying attention a crowd gives to any performance it has just watched exposed as one. "This is absurd," she said, but her voice had lost the pleasant certainty it carried at dinner tables, and no one in the gallery troubled to look convinced. Julian stepped forward then, for the first time, and spoke directly to her, quietly, though the whole room could hear him. "You forged a claim against my wife's marriage," he said, "and you did it in my own house, at my own table, in front of people who have known this family for generations. I will not have you charged, Camille, because I do not believe ruining you further serves anyone, least of all my wife, who has already spent this whole matter proving she needs no revenge to be vindicated. But you will leave Wexbourne, and you will not return, and if you ever again put your name near my wife's in any paper, forged or otherwise, I will not extend you this mercy twice." Camille looked at Cordelia for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her eyes, not quite shame, not quite fear, something closer to the particular exhaustion of a woman finally set down a weight she had carried so long she had forgotten it was heavy. "You might have simply paid me," she said low, almost to herself. "It would have been so much less trouble." I know, Cordelia said, but I have found that the only debts worth settling are the true ones. This was never going to be one of them. She turned away from Camille then, toward the room, toward 40 guests who had come for supper and dancing and left, instead having watched a scandal collapse under the honest weight of a watermark and 2 frightened clerks telling the truth. She did not gloat. She simply inclined her head, the small, precise gesture she used to close a ledger for the night, and said, to no one in particular and everyone at once, I believe the dancing was to resume shortly. Shall we? It took, in the end, a good deal longer than a single evening for the county to finish talking about it. But the talking, this time, ran entirely in her favour, the way water finally finds its true channel after years cut wrong. Camille Severin left Wexbourne within the week. For the continent, with a small sum Julian settled on her privately. Not the £3,000 she had demanded, but enough to begin again somewhere. Her name carried no weight either way. Which was, Cordelia thought, its own kind of mercy. Offered not because it was owed, but because it cost nothing to be generous from a position finally secure. Julian came to her study 3 nights after the assembly, when the house had gone quiet, and the last of the county's letters of congratulation had been answered, and he sat down across from her, with the particular carefulness of a man who has rehearsed what he means to say, and is afraid, even so, of saying it wrong. I owe you an explanation, he said, and I know the difference between that and an apology, because you taught it to me yourself the night Camille brought that document to this house. I mean to give you both, in full, if you'll hear them. I will hear them, Cordelia said. The apology first, then, he said, because it is the easier of the two, though it should not be. I am sorry. I have called you useful in this house for 2 years, as though it were the whole of what I owed you, and I let a doctrine my father built out of his own wound become the only inheritance I ever offered you. You deserved a husband who saw you the day he married you, not one who required a forged contract and a public scandal to teach him how. And the explanation. My mother left when I was 11, Julian said, and my father did not grieve her. He converted her into a lesson, the way some men convert loss into philosophy, because philosophy can be managed and loss cannot. He taught me that love was a debt that beggared the man who paid it, and that a wise man built his house on use instead, because use never packed a trunk in the night. I believed him for 20 years, Cordelia, because believing him meant I never had to feel what he felt, watching that carriage go down the drive. I married you believing I was being wise. I did not understand, until I watched you stand in that gallery with a solicitor and a paper mill's watermark, and not 1 ounce of fear in your face, that I had simply been afraid the whole time, and had called the fear wisdom because the fear was easier to live with under that name. Cordelia was quiet a long moment. Explanation is not the same as excuse, she said finally. I want that understood between us, before we go any further. I do not offer it as one. Then I will tell you what I require, she said, and I would rather say it once plainly than have you guess at it for years the way you guessed at everything else. She folded her hands on the desk. I require full authority over this estate's accounts, in name as well as practice, so that no steward, however trusted, is ever again paid for work that was never done. I require that my name be used, in full, in every document this house produces, not appended as an afterthought to yours. I require that whatever passed between you and Miss Severin before our marriage never again be a subject either of us pretends does not exist between us. I would rather know a hard truth than manage a comfortable silence. "And I require," she said, more quietly, "that when you tell me something is good work, or that you are grateful, or that I am useful to you, you understand that none of those words are the ones I am waiting to hear, and that I will go on waiting, patiently, for as long as it takes you to find the right ones, but that I will not pretend any longer that the wrong ones are sufficient." Julian looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "All right, then," Cordelia said, and something in her chest, some old careful ledger she had kept for 2 years without quite admitting she kept it, closed its books at last on one account and opened a new one. The winter that followed was not dramatic. That, Cordelia would come to think, was rather the point of it. That after a scandal answered with a watermark and a marriage nearly wrecked by a doctrine, 11 years in the making, what came next was simply a long accumulation of small, unremarkable days, each one meaning nothing at all by itself, and everything in the sum of them together. Julian began sitting with her in the estate office in the evenings, not because the ledgers required his presence, but because he had taken to reading beside her while she worked, the two of them sharing a single lamp, the way they had never once shared anything in 2 years of marriage. He began pouring her tea before she asked for it, learning without being told that she preferred it too strong and barely sweetened, a small competence he practised until he had it exactly right and never once mentioned having learned it. He moved his chair one evening in January from its accustomed place across the room to a spot beside hers at the window seat, and said nothing about the move at all, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world for a duke to relocate his reading chair 6 feet across a room for no reason he cared to name. None of it, alone, would have meant anything. Cordelia understood that, and understood too that this was precisely why it mattered, that a man capable of grand gestures under the pressure of a public scandal was not the same as a man capable of small ones, unwitnessed, on an ordinary Tuesday in February, when no one was watching to see whether he kept his word. There was one evening, in March, when he nearly failed the test. A tenant had come to him directly, bypassing Cordelia's office entirely out of old habit, to request an extension on a quarter's rent, and Julian, falling, for one unthinking hour, back into the pattern of 20 years, the pattern in which decisions about the estate were his alone to make, had granted it on the spot, without consulting the woman who now held, by his own word, full authority over exactly such accounts. Cordelia found out that evening, from the tenant's own grateful mention of it to Mrs. Pruitt, and she came to Julian's study with the ledger under her arm, and no anger in her face at all, only a very precise attentiveness. "You granted Coombe an extension today," she said. Julian's face went still, the particular stillness of a man realizing, mid-step, that he has walked back into an old habit without meaning to. "I did," he said. "I should have sent him to you." "You should have," Cordelia agreed. "Not because the extension was wrong. I would very likely have granted the same one myself, on the same terms. But because you told me, in December, that my authority over these accounts would be real, and today, when a decision came to your door instead of mine, you made it alone, the way you have made every decision alone for 20 years, without so much as a thought that the arrangement had changed." "I did not think," Julian said slowly. "That is the whole truth of it. It was not that I chose to override you. It simply did not occur to me, in the moment, that there was anyone to consult." "I know," Cordelia said. "That is precisely why I am naming it now, plainly, instead of letting it pass. Old habits do not announce themselves as betrayals. They arrive dressed as nothing at all, and if no one names them, they simply become the pattern again. She set the ledger down. I am not angry, Julian. I am clear. They are different countries, and I would rather you learn to tell them apart from me than from a stranger's gossip a year from now. It will not happen again, he said. It very likely will, Cordelia said, not unkindly, in some smaller form. Some day when you are tired or distracted, and an old habit is easier than a new one. What will matter is not whether it happens. It is whether you correct it the moment I name it, the way you are correcting it now, or whether you argue with me about whether it happened at all. Then I correct it, Julian said, and I will keep correcting it, for as long as it takes to become the man who does not need correcting. It was, Cordelia thought, watching him say it without a trace of the old defensive stiffness he would have brought to the same conversation a year before, the clearest evidence yet that whatever had changed in him was not performance. Performance did not survive being named twice in the same season. Only structure did. He came to find her a week later, on an ordinary evening with nothing at stake at all, no scandal to answer, and no ledger requiring urgent attention. And he sat down across from her at the window seat where his chair now permanently lived, and he took her hand in both of his in a way he had never once done in 2 years of marriage, without some practical reason attached to the gesture. I have been thinking, he said, about the word you told me you were waiting for, the one that was not useful, and was not grateful, and was not good work. I remember telling you that, Cordelia said. I do not think it is a single word in the end, Julian said. I think my father was wrong about that too. Along with everything else, he thought love was a debt, 3 syllables, easily said and easily broken. I do not think it can be said honestly in 3 syllables at all. I think it has to be said the way you taught me to keep a ledger, in the sum of many small entries, none of them proof by themselves, all of them proof together. He paused. So I will not tell you I love you, tonight, because I do not think the words alone have earned the right to mean anything yet. I will tell you instead that I would choose you, that I have been choosing you, in fact since October, in every particular way I know how, and that I intend to go on choosing you for as long as you will let me, whether or not you ever again need a single thing from me that a ledger could record. Cordelia was quiet a moment, and something in her chest, the old drawer, the brass key, the 10 careful minutes she had rationed herself every Sunday for 2 years, simply opened on its own, without her permission, and did not ask to be shut again. Elle n'est pas utile, Julian said quietly, in French, watching her face. Elle est aime. She is not useful. She is loved. I believe that is the sentence someone owed you a long while ago, in the language it was first said wrong in. I thought you should hear it said right, at last, by the person who ought to have said it from the beginning. Cordelia did not answer him in words at all. She reached up, unclasped the ribbon at her throat, and set her mother's ring into his open palm, and said only, "Have this made to fit my hand properly. I find I am tired of carrying the only thing that was ever mine where no one else can see it." He had it done within the fortnight, taken to a jeweller in the county town, and reset onto a band sized to her finger, rather than a ribbon meant for hiding. And when he gave it back to her, he said nothing at all about what it meant, because by then they had both learned that the meaning of a thing was rarely improved by saying it aloud twice. 2 years passed, in the way years do at Rowden Hall, harvests better than the one that had opened this account. Tenant leases renewed on terms, posted plainly for any man to read. A daughter born in the spring of the 2nd year, and named Margaret, for Cordelia's mother, whose ring she now wore openly on her right hand at every dinner the county hosted. Camille Severin, it was said, had settled eventually in Brussels, teaching French to the daughters of merchants who paid her honestly for honest work, which was, Cordelia thought when she heard of it, a fairer end than the woman's scheme had deserved, and very likely a better one than the woman's old life had offered. Ellery Finch had lost his position at the solicitor's office and taken up a clerkship in a shipping firm 2 counties distant, where forged contracts were considerably harder to draft undetected. Peter Wick, whose honest fright had helped unmake the whole scheme, was given a position in Mr. Crane's own office the following spring, at Cordelia's particular recommendation, because a young man who tells the truth when it costs him something is, in her experience, worth rather more than his current wages suggested. The Rowden estate posted its tenant wage scale publicly every Michaelmas now, a practice Cordelia had begun the winter after the assembly, and Julian had continued without being asked, because a house that had once paid a dishonest steward for roofs never mended owed its honest tenants nothing less than transparency, permanently, as a matter of principle rather than crisis. A small school had opened in the village the second spring, funded jointly by the estate and the parish, teaching sums and letters to the sons and daughters of tenant families who had never before been offered either. And Cordelia herself sat in on its lessons some Tuesday mornings, watching children learn columns of figures the way her own father had once taught her. In a room that smelled of chalk and wood smoke, and felt, in its own small way, like a debt finally being paid forward rather than collected. Rowden Hall itself, in the 2 years since that October dinner, had undergone a change no visitor could quite name, but every visitor remarked on none the less, a looseness in its rooms, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fires, the particular ease of a house that has stopped holding its breath. Mrs. Pruitt said once to Lady Agatha, over tea in the dower cottage, that she had served the family 33 years now, and had never once, until the last 2 of them, heard the house make the sound an old building makes when it finally exhales, settling into itself at night, not out of age, she said, but out of ease. The way a person settles when they have stopped waiting for something to go wrong. Cordelia Ashfield, Duchess of Rowden, sat at her writing desk one evening in the autumn of 1818, her daughter asleep upstairs, her husband reading beside her in the chair he had moved to her window-seat 2 winters before, and she thought, not for the first time, of the sentence her father had left her, the one she had repeated to herself through every ledger and every humiliation and every quiet 10 minutes behind a locked drawer. A woman who is prepared owes fear to no one. She had been prepared, that October evening, with nothing more than a language she had never told anyone she spoke, and a mother's ring hidden where no one could see it. She had not known then that preparedness would carry her so far, through a forged contract and a public reckoning, and a husband's slow unlearning of a doctrine built from his own father's grief. But she understood now, looking back, that it had never been the French, or the ledgers, or even the watermark on a stolen sheet of paper that had won her anything at all. It had been the plain, unglamorous discipline of building something true, while other people were still deciding whether to believe her. She had not been loved, once, in a house that called her useful instead. She had not argued with that verdict, and she had not wept over it, and she had not tried to prove it wrong with speeches. She had simply gone on being exactly as useful as she pleased, on her own terms, in her own hand, until the house itself had no honest choice left but to recalculate what it owed her. She had stopped asking to be seen. She had made herself, instead, impossible to unsee. And that, she thought, setting down her pen at last, and reaching for the ring on her hand rather than the ribbon at her throat, was not a thing any man's doctrine, however old, however carefully inherited, could ever again take from her.